Hi there, Steve here. Today, this video, I'm going to talk about politics, and unless I get a tremendously negative response, I'm going to continue to do the odd video on politics because I enjoy doing it, and I enjoy the reaction that I get and the response and exchange of positions. I don't expect to persuade anyone of my views. I'm very realistic. I don't think that other people should expect to persuade anyone of their views. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't exchange views. It stimulates the mind. At the very least, it stimulates you to defend your own views, and quite possibly it opens you up to some other perspectives. So I'm going to talk about the situation in Ukraine, and I'm going to start with a very interesting video that I saw, I guess it's now 2 evenings ago, where on this Ukrainian news opinion program called Schuster Live, where the host actually speaks Russian. Most of the people on the program speak Ukrainian, but a lot of them also speak Russian. And as I've said before, it seems that in Ukraine, Ukrainian Russian doesn't seem to bother anyone in reality. Although the issue of language is very political there, in fact, people seem to be able to communicate quite well. One person speaking Ukrainian, the other person speaking Russian. So Dobkin is interviewed by Schuster. The first very interesting thing is that Dobkin, who is the former mayor, I believe, of Kharkiv, the second largest city in Ukraine. I don't know that he was the governor there, but he was certainly the mayor of Kharkiv. And in fact, in my little description thing, I'm going to put a link to a rather amusing video of him getting ready to make some kind of a video presentation to the good citizens of Kharkiv. So the interesting thing is that Dobkin is under house arrest in Ukraine. And why is he under house arrest? According to what either Schuster or Dobkin said in the interview, is because he said, quote, "We shouldn't be afraid of the word federalism or federalization or federalism." And that was considered a separatist statement, and therefore he was put under house arrest. So my immediate reaction as a Canadian is to say, like, what? Canada is a federation. Not only is Canada a federation, but one of the provinces has been ruled for a good part of the last 35 years by a separatist government. And that the separatist government on 2 occasions has organized a referendum on separation. And while there were detailed rules about how much advertising for the yes and the no and stuff like that, which our federal government tried to circumvent, and that created a big scandal. Nevertheless, there have been 2 referenda. And so the government, the separatist government of Quebec, regularly participates in meetings with the other provincial premiers in Canada. So the word federalist in a Quebec context means someone who is pro the central government, and a separatist is someone who wants to separate, but he's still not a criminal. But in Ukraine, the word federalist is almost criminal, and the word separatist is like traitor. So that comes as a bit of a shock initially. Then there was another portion of the discussion where Dobkin said, you know, we've lost Crimea. We should stop saying we're going to get it back, because we can't just get it back. However, what happened there is that those people decided to become Russian. So if we want them back, we have to persuade those people to want to become Ukrainian again. When I hear that, I say to myself, so there's an issue here of persuading people whether they want to be this or that. That seems to open up Pandora's box in terms of trying to persuade citizens of eastern or southern Ukraine to become Russian or Ukrainian. In other words, if it's a matter of constantly trying to persuade people where they belong, that opens opportunities for more referenda. Not to mention the fact that quite obviously in Russia, you are not allowed to have a referendum on independence, let alone joining another country. So that however much persuading Dobkin and other Ukrainians might try to do, there's no way they could influence the future of Crimea. But it raises another interesting point, and that is that in what we see happening in Ukraine, what I see is it's a conflict of nationalisms. And I know there was a book written about, the what is it? The conflict of civilizations, or I can't remember what word was used, that there's going to be this clash of civilizations. But what we're seeing really is particularly in former communist countries, we're seeing a renewal of nationalism, which is creating all kinds of tensions. We had the sort of gentle separation in Czechoslovakia, where the Czechs and Slovaks went their own way, and they're now as friendly or more friendly with each other than they've ever been. But we also had Yugoslavia. So their nationalisms were suppressed. All of a sudden, the lid was taken off, and we had the horrible sort of bloodshed. Now we see Russia as the sort of Soviet, the internationalism of the communists and the Soviets has been removed. Now the Russians are discovering their national identity, their nationalism, and their nationalism as ethnic Russians. And this poses very interesting questions, because in Russia, the country, in fact, consists of many different nationalities, ethnic groups, people in the Caucasus, the Tatars, and others. But the message in Russia is one very much of the sort of Russian spirit, Russian soul, Russian culture, Russian language, Russian Orthodox Russian Church. So their nationalism is being built around the sort of ethnic Russian thing. And so there you have that sort of increasingly strident nationalism in Russia. And so they look around and they say, what's the matter with us? We got brothers and sisters, Russians living in Ukraine, Latvia, Kazakhstan, whatever, Estonia. We got to look after those people because that's our nation. That's this whole nationalism thing, which was dormant for so long, is now becoming more powerful. So, and then you have in the Ukraine, you have the nationalism of the largely Ukrainian-speaking Western Central Ukrainians, where the language becomes a sign of their national identity. And then you have the people in the east and south of the Ukraine, some of whom are Russians who moved there under the Soviet Union when they were building up the industrial base there. Some of whom, personally, there's probably so much intermarriage, and so many of them simply speak Russian that even people with Ukrainian names who speak Russian, culturally Russian, I don't see how you can distinguish those people from someone who for 2 or 3 generations has lived in Ukraine, speaks Russian, and whose family originally came from Russia. And I gather there's a lot of family connections across the border, cultural connections, and so forth. So if it turns out, and I don't know this, but if it turns out that those in the Western Ukraine have a sense of their nationalism, which is built around different history, being under Poland, the Polish-Lithuanian, whatever kingdom, being under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, being under Poland, therefore more oriented towards the West. And if those in the East were under the Tsars, were under the Soviet Union, are culturally connected to the Russian world, if Russian nationalism is rising, then how attractive is that to those Russian speakers or Russian ethnic people, cultural Russians who live in the East and the South? Probably quite attractive. And if I look at the history of Ukraine, it seems that every 5 years, either the Eastern and Southern Ukrainians vote in their party of people who, corrupt leaders who basically skim large amounts of money out of the system. And then the other period, they get people from the West to do the same, equally disorganized, equally ineffective, and equally corrupt. So it seems as if there's a constant seesawing between the East and the West. So what I don't know is how strong is the feeling of Ukrainianness in the East and the South. And of course, these kinds of feelings of identity can change. Again, having studied Czech, German speakers were 30% of the population of Czechoslovakia between the wars. And I gather for an initial 15 years or so, they were quite happy to participate in Czech or Czechoslovakian political life, complaining that they didn't get enough language rights, complaining about X, Y, and Z, but still participating in the government. But then, as German nationalism grew, and with a lot of propaganda beamed at them from Hitler's Germany, more and more of these, call them Sudeten Germans, wanted to be part of Germany. Now, to be fair, at the end of the First World War, the German speakers in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, that is the Sudeten Germans, the Austrians, the people in what's known as Alto Adige, Südtirol, in what is now Italy, but they're German speakers, they all wanted to be part of the same country, and they weren't allowed to do that because the Allies wanted to weaken Germany. And so they lived separately. So all of a sudden, Germany is on the rise and stirs up these people, and now these people are very unhappy and they have to be part of Germany, and so Germany uses all of this as justification for what led up to the Munich Agreement. And there are also German speakers in Poland. So Germany now, this strident nationalist Germany, feels that they have a right and an obligation to look after their brothers and sisters who obviously are being maltreated in these other countries. And so this now is a similar scenario to what we're seeing in Ukraine. You have on the one hand the Western Ukrainians who had a great time there. They overthrew Yanukovych, but they installed therefore a government that is more dominated by Western Ukrainians. Not exclusively, but mostly. And so how does that make the Eastern or Southern Ukrainians feel? And I also know from looking at opinion polls that historically the Western Ukrainians are more in favor of joining the the European Union, and the Eastern and Southern Ukrainians, not surprisingly, are more in favor of joining what's called the customs union and aligning themselves with Russia. So they sit there and they say, oh, the Western guys have taken over now. So now, whereas, say, a year or 2 years ago, opinion polls in Eastern and Southern Ukraine and Crimea showed lukewarm interest in joining Russia, because after all, their guy was in power, Yanukovych. But once their guy is no longer in power, and you have these other guys, maybe now they're not so keen on being in Ukraine, they're more keen on joining Russia. And if you add into that the tremendously aggressive propaganda barrage from Russia, telling them that they're under attack and they're all going to be shot up and they're all fascists in Kiev, all of which is essentially, I would call it false, because the degree of danger in Ukraine, of insecurity, is, even with the latest shooting in Kiev, is probably less than what it is in Russia. Again, looking at my statistics on the internet, the crime rate, the murder rate in Ukraine historically is like a half to a third of what it is in Russia. And when you add in the problems the Russians have with terrorists from the Caucasus and so forth and so on, even with the right sector, odd guy shooting people up, it makes the headlines. But in fact, people are not in any great danger in Ukraine, despite the propaganda barrage from the Russians. Also, the Russians make a big point of how illegitimate, the new government is, because Yanukovych was elected, but Hitler was elected. And over the last, the 2-3 years of his term, I mean, there's a reason why we had these demonstrations in Ukraine. Yanukovych created conditions where a lot of people were unhappy. And my understanding is a lot of people demonstrating in the Maidan, the freedom demonstrators, were not necessarily all committed to joining the European Union. A lot of it had to do with their dissatisfaction with the government, corrupt. It had been increasingly restricting, the press and the media. It put this political opponent, Tymoshenko, in jail. To the extent that Yanukovych was in power, he's responsible for the events of the Maidan. They happened under his watch. And I think the news will come out that a lot of the brutality and the sniper activity and so forth were also directed by Yanukovych. So the fact that someone was elected doesn't mean that and if that elected person is continuing to abuse their position, then there may very well be a popular uprising. Subsequent to that, a majority of the members of the Verkhovna Rada, the parliament, in fact, agreed to work together to form this new government. A new government which, in my opinion, should have been some kind of a coalition government. And I think that was initially proposed. And I think that the Western Ukrainians who dominate this new government are far too strident in insisting on their agenda. You know, the first thing they tried to do was change the language laws, which they had to, you know, give away on. And, you know, in their comments about Russia, they're so strident. You know, I think Turchinov, the president, said that Crimea will become Russia's Afghanistan, Putin's Afghanistan, and stuff like this. There's just a lot of unnecessary aggravation there. But fundamentally, to me, it's an issue of the clash of nationalisms. And the big question to me is, where is the allegiance of the people in the eastern and southern Ukraine? And the unfortunate thing is that because those people are basically plugged into the Russian media, they are being totally bombarded with the Russian, you know, propaganda message. And I think the government in Kiev should be thinking about how they can reach out to and persuade those people that they'll be better off in Ukraine, rather than being stridently, you know, anti-Putin, anti-Russia, and all the rest of it. They've kind of somehow, and I think in that sense, I read again in the Ukrainian, because I'm trying to read Ukrainian, in the Ukrainian newspaper online, that they've taken sort of photo displays of the Maidan to various cities in eastern Ukraine, and they're trying to explain to them why they think the changes that they're hoping to bring about will improve living conditions throughout Ukraine. Because after all, I am sure that the Ukrainians everywhere would like to live better, earn more money, not have politicians that siphon off millions and billions of dollars and build extravagant mansions and so forth. They would like to be governed better. They would like to live, probably, even though the allegiance in the East may be more towards a Russian Eurasian community, they would like to live under the same conditions and institutions as exist in Western Europe, without necessarily having to ally themselves with Western Europe. So my take on all of this is that we're talking about a clash of nationalisms that were kind of kept under the lid during the Soviet period. And by the way, it's not just Ukraine. If you go to Latvia, I haven't been to Estonia, but in Latvia, the Latvians now have this sense that their little group of 1.5 million people is threatened because there's 40% Russians there. Can those Russian speakers buy into the Latvian national agenda, or are they a perennial sort of outpost of the Russian diaspora, a potential fifth column? That's a big concern, especially with a strident Russian nationalism, which is bound to infect Russians living over the border in Latvia. And so these are all very interesting questions of how much, you know, the Latvians would like to convert all those Russians into Latvians. Is that going to happen? I don't know. So those are some of the issues. I see these as a Canadian, you know, as very interesting, because my attitude here in Canada, where we receive a lot of immigrants, is I would like those people to assimilate. I would like them, and that has typically been the case in the past, that whether they come from the Ukraine, and the Ukrainians initially were the big promoters of multiculturalism and getting government funding for Ukrainian language programs, and, you know, money for them to paint Easter eggs and dance in their national costumes and stuff, which I think they should do on their own ticket. And it's not something that I think the Canadian government should promote. We shouldn't prevent them, obviously. They do what they want. And I don't even think we shouldn't force assimilate people, but we should encourage people to feel that whoever their neighbor is, whether they're from China, Afghanistan, Portugal, you know, Japan, doesn't matter, they're Canadian, so that there is a sense of solidarity and you're building up a sense of identity. And identity is a subjective thing, and it moves and changes depending on a lot of circumstances. And I think that's also going to be an issue in the Ukraine, is where is the identity of those people in eastern Ukraine? And quite frankly, I don't know what it is. But hopefully that these kinds of issues can be resolved in a peaceful way, rather than the kind of precedent that we have in the 1930s. So there's my little ramble just to get started, and I look forward to opinions and ideas and hope to do more of these. Bye for now.